Hello. Thank you for the nice introduction. So welcome all. I'm happy to see some people here. I was a bit worried 5 minutes ago, but cool, we have an audience. Great. So I'm going to talk about the best practices for releasing games on the web. How many of you are game developers? How many of you release games on the web? Some of you. Okay, so some know what I'm talking about. Others, I hope you'll be enlightened and learn some and be interested in web games. So I'm going to start by just talking very briefly about Defold. Then I'm going to go through some of the best practices when releasing HTML5 games. I'm going to talk a bit about distribution, how you monetize your games, how you convert your players into actual players, something about optimizing the game size, because that's important on the web. And then if we have time, I'm going to briefly touch upon some of the web game standards that you should think about when releasing on the web. This is going to be a very opinionated talk, so it's based on my experience working with web game developers, with various platform partners such as Pokey, Facebook, Yandex, and also my own experience. So first of all, my name is Björn. I'm from Stockholm in Sweden. I work with the Defold Foundation. I'm a recurring expert in the JS13K Games competition. I'm a part of the WV3C community group on web games, and I've been on the program committee for the JS gamedev summit. So first of all, who knows what Defold is? Okay, half the room. Cool, so Defold is a cross-platform game engine. So it's not only focused on the web, but you can publish for the web, for desktop, for mobile, and also for consoles or Nintendo Switch currently, and we're working on PS4 support. So it's a full game engine with a full editor. You can do 2D and 3D games, particle effects, physics. There is a scene editor. You script using the Lua scripting language. So it's a full suite of tools for creating games. It's also like we follow what we call a zero setup policy, which means that you have a single download. It automatically updates. You never need to install any additional tools. So you can, from your initial install, without installing any additional tools, create a mobile phone game or a web game or a desktop game. So no need to install any developer tools. So anyone here can just download and get started. We work with some various partners. Melsoft, based here in Vilnius, they're one of our corporate partners. They have a mobile game called Family Island. We also have a lot of games released on the web. Pokey is one of the platforms where our developers have a lot of success. Yandex is another. So last year there was over 100 million plays of games made in Defold on Pokey. Brief history: Defold started as a side project by two guys working at Avalanche, was a AAA studio in Stockholm. They turned it into their full-time business and were acquired by King in 2014. That's when I joined the team. I was working as a consultant at King at the time. We used it as an internal engine for 2 years, and then at GDC we decided to give away the engine for free. So it was a closed source product that you could download and use. There was no licensing fees or royalties or anything, so anyone could download and use it. And from that point we saw like organic growth of the engine, a lot of adoption among indie developers, smaller studios, to the point that in 2020, just before the pandemic hit, we decided that, hey, we should probably move this outside of King. So in 2020, we, together with King, decided to move Defold into a separate legal entity with no ties to King anymore, no single owner. So it's a software foundation, so not a company, created in Stockholm. So we got some seed money from King, the trademarks and all of the source code, and since then we've operated as an independent entity with our base in Stockholm. We're 6 developers working on the engine. Funded through corporate partnerships and like donations on Patreon and GitHub patrons and so on. All right, so that's an introduction to Defold. So now let's jump into the actual topic of the talk. So how to release games for HTML5. And there's a number of things to think about. First of all, distribution. So where to release and how to release your game. And if you think about mobile, for instance, you have like Google Play and the Apple App Store, that's it. On desktop, you probably want to release on Steam, maybe on the Epic Game Store. But for the web, there is a huge amount of different platforms to release on. It's a jungle, and this is just like some of the platforms you could potentially release your game on. Some are open, like itch.io. Anyone can upload a game without any kind of validation. Others are more curated, where you have to go through an approval process. Some of these are publishers. So you really need to think about like who is going to be my launch partner, especially if you're making this as a business. Then you need to analyze the kind of games that you find on a certain platform, and then what seems to be the target audience here. What kind of games are people playing on Poki or on Yandex, and then think about the kind of game that you want to create and find the right launch partner. And once you've figured out where to release your game, you also need to think about, am I doing this for fun or for money? There was, if you followed Twitter and other social media, there was a lot of discussion about people making games for fun and how they are not right in the head. I'm not going to name any names, but it was a Twitter storm. Anyway, if you're making games for fun or as a business, doesn't matter. Both are okay. You can use Defold for both. I have an example here. We have a community member, Ben James, independent developer in the UK. He's probably released like 40 games for free on itch.io, doing them as part of game jams. He's also released all of his games as open source, so anyone can download them and modify them. That's just one example. And in general, like doing games on game jams, that's typically the way to do games just for fun, without any thought on monetization. But if you are into this as a business, you need to make money, make a living out of making games, then you actually need to think about monetization from the start. So really, think about the how to design your game to be a game that can be monetized. And on the web, you have a couple of different ways to monetize your game. I would say that the most popular way is through ads, without a doubt. Most of the larger platforms like Poki, Yandex, Game Distribution, Facebook, and some others, they have their own ad SDKs, and you need to integrate those. So you can't like use another ad solution. You need to use the one provided by them. We have recently started talking to Google about their new ad placement API for H5 games. So it's a new API that is not affiliated with a specific platform. So that would be perfect to use if you're releasing games on itch.io and actually want to make ad revenue of the game as well. But in general, you need to implement the SDK that comes with the platform that you release on. Other alternatives is obviously also to, you could just sell your game to a publisher or license it to many publishers. And that would be like a one-off revenue for your game. In-app purchases, which is more popular on mobile games, like native mobile games, you also have these kind of ways to monetize, but it's not as common on the web. So I definitely say that ad revenue is what you're aiming for. So you need to design your game around the concept of ad revenue, and the game loop should be designed around that. All right, so once you've figured out where to release your game, you need to also think about how to get as many players as possible. I'm going to use a term coined by Poki, which was one of the web platforms. They have a term called conversion to player. It's actually a metric. So they measure from the time that a player discovers your game on their website until they have played their first session. They measure how many players that drop off from the point that they click the game icon on the page with all of the games until they have played the first session. And so for instance, for a 10 meg game, like an average game on their platform, in the US, where you have a fast internet connection, they saw that 1 out of 5 players dropped off. They never completed the process of launching the game fully and playing the first session. And in countries such as Egypt, where they have a horrible internet connection, they saw that 2 out of 5 players dropped off. So this tells us that the loading experience and the time it takes to load a web game is super important, because you will lose players if the game takes too long to play. But it's also not only about the size of your game and how fast it loads, but it's the entire, experience from discovery, how it loads, then the menus or other steps you have to go through before you can play the game. All of that is important, and especially if you're making this as a business, you need to get players playing as fast as possible. And when it comes to discovery, you have typically, like, this is for Pokey, that's a Yandex page. Can't remember if that's Facebook, maybe, in the back there. But anyway, this is what you see. So you need to compete with all of these games, and you need to be the game that the player clicks if they're just looking for some entertainment. So you need to really analyze the way you should design your icon, for instance. It should be scalable, it should be using contrasting colors, it should be easily distinguishable at a glance. You should really think about that. And it's a bit different between the platforms, how you design your game icon and the banner, and also possibly the game title might have an impact. So if you can do some kind of A/B testing to figure out which is the best way for you to be discovered on this page of games, that's like the first hurdle to go through. And the next part, which is interesting, is that us humans, we suck at attention. We're actually worse than goldfish right now. So with the whole mobile revolution and with the very easy way to get some kind of gratification, browsing Instagram or going to another social media outlet for some kind of entertainment, we really, really suck at waiting. We need to be gratified somehow. So you basically have 8 seconds from discovery until you give the player some kind of reward in their game. So that's the time frame we have to play with. If it takes longer, it's likely that the player will lose interest, switch to something that loads faster or to something other than a game. So for the loading experience, the utopia would be that there is no loading time at all, but that's very unlikely. Even us developers who are very spoiled with good internet connections and all of that, it's very likely that it will take some time to load your game. So that's one thing to consider. You need to have, first of all, a small game, but also think about the loading experience in general. So make it visually interesting, have a nice loading screen with a progress bar, maybe show helpful tips. And for us developers, as I said, with a fast internet connection, we should not just load our game using our proper gigabit internet connection, but we should at times simulate a slow connection. So if you're a developer, you can easily toggle this in your Chrome developer tools. You can set to a slow internet connection and actually test your loading experience and get the feeling for how it is for maybe someone in Egypt, maybe trying to load your game. So think about that and actually spend some time at least on your splash or loading screen. And then once the game is loaded and you're ready to show your game content, you should also think about some kind of shortcuts to the fun, because you need to reward the player for waiting. So one idea that I've seen many games implement is that for a new player, they skip any kind of menus, difficulty selections. They just drop the player straight into a tutorial level, so they immediately get to your game. And this could also be applied, to a player that comes back to your game. So having very quickly a replay button or play next level or continue, to not have to go through a lot of menus, because that also could impact your conversion of players. another interesting thing, I'm not sure if you remember this game. It was an awesome web game by Adam Saltzman. In an article, he talked about generous game design, which means that giving the player something that is gratifying, cool, that gives them the belief in your game. So like the intro sequence, when the guy jumps out the window, lands in shards of glass and birds fly away and the cool music comes on, that's like selling your game to players in a really good way. And I think you should consider this as well when you design your game. Like, make sure to wow your players as soon as they get into the action. Don't just wait and show like something boring to begin with, and give them something immediately when they play. That will like buy you credit with the players. And also, there is another term called the Starbucks test. So your game should contain some kind of reward. You should be able to do something meaningful in your game in the time it takes to order a coffee. So it could be like playing a time challenge in the Buell Blitz game, or it could be collecting a reward in your game. But there should be something for the player to do in a short period of time, because that's usually, and especially for web games played on mobile phones, that's very similar to mobile phones in general, and games on mobile phones, that players pick up their phone to play a game while doing something else. So another good idea to think about. All right. Are you with me? Excellent. So when we talked about the loading experience, we also talked about the time it takes to load the game, and it's obvious that the size of the game matters quite a lot. And for the size of the game, it's not just like the game content, but also the game engine that you use. So when you pick a game engine for your game, for your web game, you need to think about the size. What's the size of like a minimal project exported using your game engine? In the case of Defold, the size of like an empty project is less than a megabyte in size when it's gzipped. If you use like a pure JavaScript game engine like Phaser, you will get an even smaller package, but with the disadvantage that it's only for web games. So if your game becomes a hit, or if you want to move it to mobile or console, you need to port it. With Defold, you get a slightly larger export, but you also have the ability to move it to another platform as well. You should also look into if you can optimize the size of the game further. So in Defold, for instance, you can strip away content that you don't need, or features in the engine that you don't need. So if you don't have physics at all in your game, any physics simulations, you can remove the physics part of the engine and get an even smaller download size. I think Phaser has something similar as well, where you can strip away parts of your engine. But so this is very important. It's a technical thing, but it's, you shouldn't pick an engine that is wasteful with the size of your game, because that will, as we saw, you'll lose players by that. So really pay attention to the engine you choose. And that's one bit. Then obviously you also have like the game content itself. So it's usually like all of the images in your game, the sounds, all of that adds up, obviously. And you want to do all you can to minimize the game content as much as possible. So using texture compression, packing images into texture, compressing sounds, possibly opting for mono sounds instead. Maybe using procedural sounds, so you don't have any sounds at all, just generate sounds on the fly. Could work for like an 8-bit NES kind of game with that kind of feeling for sounds. For textures, we do like basic texture packing in Defold. WebP, which is great for the web. We currently don't have that, but we're working on it, I promise you. Also, when the game is served, downloaded from the server to the client, you usually also, the server will gzip the content. So it will compress it and then decompress it when it reaches your browser. And that's usually something that the launch partner or the platform you use will take care of. But in Defold, we also take all of the game assets and put them into a game archive and add further compression onto that as well. Next up is also to think about your game in general. Could you split it up into multiple pieces and only download what's needed initially? So let's say that you have a level-based game. There's no point in downloading all of the levels in the game immediately. It might be just better to segment your game into chunks, download the first few levels, so you have a smaller download, convert more players, and as the players progress through your game, you can download additional content, more levels, or more skins or themes or whatever, but don't pack all of it into a single download. That's just a waste, especially if we need to keep the size of the games as small as possible. In Defold, we have something called Live Update, which allows you to split up your content into multiple parts and then download them on the fly, mount them, and make them available to the player. All right. Finally, I'm going to talk a bit about some of the web game standards or expectations on web games. It's 4 points here, so we'll go through those. I'm going to talk a bit about mobile, gamepads, sound and music, and localization. So first of all, it's very common nowadays that you play web games even on a mobile phone. Phones today are super powerful. You can definitely run a game exported in Defold or in Phaser on a mobile phone without any problems at all. You will usually get very good performance. So for platforms such as Poké or Yandex or Facebook Instant Games, it's obvious that you should make them work on mobile as well. So consider the orientation of your game. So can it be played both in landscape and portrait mode, or should you lock it? What about different aspect ratios? How do you handle that? Should you show more content, or should you put up the black bars on the sides of the game? On phones nowadays, you also have a camera notch, or a hole punch, so the camera is all of a sudden inside your screen. So you need to think about not placing any vital content under the camera, because that's not good. For Defold, there's really no special configuration needed. A Defold web export would run really well on mobile. So I encourage you to go to Poké and try, for instance, Foggy Fox, but any other game. There's a game called Puffy Cats. It runs really well on mobile as well. I would also encourage you to support gamepads. It works in nearly any browser, even on mobile. It's really good, especially if you consider porting to other platforms or decide to go for consoles. Then it's really good to have thought about gamepad input from the start. It reduces the burden of porting. Usually, it's quite easy to export, but players on desktop or console obviously expect to play with a gamepad. So think about that. You should also think about what happens if the gamepad gets disconnected or runs out of battery. How do you handle that in-game? The recommendation on Nintendo Switch, for instance, is that you bring up a pause menu. In Defold, you can easily detect if a gamepad disconnects using gamepad events. For sound, there's also some considerations on the web. In 2018, there was a change in the autoplay policy for sounds in browsers. So previously you could start playing sounds or the menu music immediately when the game launched, but that's not possible anymore. So to play sounds, you first need to detect some kind of user interaction in the game before you can play sounds. Another thing to think about is that the ad SDKs usually or never pause the sounds while the ads are shown. So you need to think about pausing the sound in your game while the ad is shown and then play it again, and also remember the configuration between game sessions and after an ad break. Finally, localization, it's definitely worth spending the dollars to localize your game content. I mean, it's best if the game requires as little text as possible, but that's not possible for all games, obviously. But like the minimum would be like English, French, Italian, German, and Spanish, and then depending on launch partner, you want to probably localize to more languages. So Yandex, for instance, that's like Russian as well. For game distribution, they usually have like Polish and Portuguese as well. But yeah, think about that because it really helps with the conversion of players, especially if the game also has like one of these launch pages before you start the game. If there is localized content, that will convert more players. And I think that's it. So a summary, think about distribution, really analyze the platform you plan to launch on. Does your game fit on the platform you have in mind, or should you actually find another launch partner? For monetization, ads is probably the easiest and most, it's the most common at least. Think about how to convert your players. So think about all the way through discovery, like the game icon, to the loading experience, and then like rewarding the player early on in your game to get them to stay with your game and give it more time. Also, optimize the game size as much as possible. Think about the engine you choose. Choose an engine that is good for the web. And then the web game standards that we mentioned at the end here. And that's it. Thank you. Do we have any questions? Did we pass the mic?
The mic, yeah.
Yeah, or could you pass yours maybe?
Sure. Oh, we're getting a mic.
Ah,
there.
there's one more coming.
There's one.
Hi, I'm Alex from iGrind, Quality Assurance, and I have questions. How you save these games at hackers? Maybe in this idea are they built-in security tools and special encryptions?
So how I protect my game against hackers?
Yes.
That's the question.
Yes.
Well, if the game runs in the client, it's almost impossible for you to completely protect yourself against a hacker. Then you'd have to have like validation of gameplay on a server. But what we do in Defold, for instance, we have an option for you to encrypt all of your game logic, so you can encrypt that. You could potentially send the checksum to a server and validate that nothing is changed, but that's, I mean, that could easily be circumvented by a hacker as well. So I don't have like, there is no magic solution to protecting against hackers. If the hacker or attacker is dedicated enough, they will get access to your game content and they will be able to modify it. I mean, one thing, if you can detect hackers, I was at the Develop conference in Brighton, and there's a company called AnyBrain. They analyze player behavior and can very easily spot a hacker and then, or a cheater. And then you could potentially, if it's an online game, you could just move all of the cheaters to a separate server and let them play against each other, so they don't pollute like the global space of players.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions?
Hey, so I haven't been following the Defold news for a couple of years now, but I like the modular structure that you are pushing, like with the example of 3D physics turned off and reducing the build size. I was wondering how it works like in package management and all that for the official packages that you can turn on and off for custom packages, like are there some store where you can find them, and about like versioning if I want to make some package, and for example in Unity, if you are doing like in hosting, you can host it on GitHub, you can have branches, you can have like versions and all that. And have you thought, is it possible to sell some package so that you're making it for a living, for example, or is it just open source and free for all packages right now?
Okay, that's a good question. So we have a way to extend the game, or to extend the engine and the game logic with additional functionality. We call it extensions. It could be native extensions, so you add in additional native code, like add SDKs, or it could also be just like additional modules built on top of the engine. So we have what we call an asset portal, not a store, because all of the assets that we feature there are free. It's not a necessity, but we don't deal with selling plugins. What developers typically do, and all of the official extensions that we support, they're all hosted on GitHub. And it's basically just the zip file to a specific branch in the repository. So it's very easy to manage versions. It's easy for developers to lock down an extension to a specific version. And yeah, that's how it works. There is no, I mean, if you're an extension developer, you could potentially sell it, but then you need to manage access on your own.
Thank you.
Thank you. Third question?
Hi, my name is Slava. I have one question. I am not very well aware of HTML5 games, but I have one question regarding concurrency. How concurrency works in your engine and basically in this HTML5? Is it like any problems? How many threads you can create? Because some games require, for example, for mobile games, it requires like a lot of threads and something like this.
Okay.
How do you handle this in HTML? Thank you.
Well, so there was something called web workers that could be used to simulate threads, but we had this Spectre and Meltdown security issues in browsers a couple of years back, and then like browser vendors backed off from web workers. I think they've now found a way to secure web workers such that it could potentially be used. We use mscripten to cross-compile the C code to JavaScript or WebAssembly, and I think that the latest version actually supports threads. I'm not entirely sure. What you also can do is we use Lua as a scripting language, and it has something called coroutines, which could simulate threads. They're not running in parallel, but you could give control to a coroutine for a while and then yield back to the main thread.
Right, sweet. Thank you so much for such an informative speech.